I guess the recording. Pause. 1, 2, 3. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Tales from the Wandering Scribe. I am your host, Gabriel Garcia, otherwise known as the Scribe and the Wandering Quill. Today, we are doing a historian's interview. Yes, I know it's been a long time. We are now getting back to our historian's interview. And my guest today is a fantastic guest. She has her master's from the University of Leiden in global and colonial history. She has her bachelor's in public history, is a freelance worker in the field of history, has worked in museums, has her own podcast, which she will describe later on in the interview. And her ultimate goal in history is to make it accessible and impactful for non-historians to understand it and really see the value in history. Joining us today for the first time on the podcast is Professor Meredith Walker. Professor Meredith, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. I'm really looking forward to it.
Thank you, thank you. So before we dive into the questions, tell us a little bit more about yourself and just a brief overview of your academic journey.
So my academic journey is actually pretty varied. I did not start out majoring in history. I actually, I'm sure we'll have time to talk about this more later, but I actually didn't like history a lot growing up.
Oh, okay.
I had some really bad history teachers when I was in junior high and high school. They made it pretty boring. I just I kind of dreaded history class in a lot of ways. And so I ended up going to school for journalism, and then I switched to political science, and then I dropped out of that, and I kind of just was in a kind of weird period of my life in my mid-20s where I didn't really know what I wanted to do. Eventually I came to realize that I actually did like history. It's just that the way it had been taught to me before was terrible. And so I went back to school for it, and I finished my bachelor's pretty quickly, and I knew I wanted to go overseas to study.
All right.
And so I visited the Netherlands. I toured a couple of schools and really kind of fell in love with Leiden, the city and the school itself, and applied. And I was lucky enough to get in. It was I still have imposter syndrome about about getting into the university. And had a really good time there. It was really, really amazing. I had some really great professors, even though I was there during the pandemic. So it kind of was a little more difficult than it might have been otherwise to make connections and socialize. But I had a really, really great thesis advisor, and she really encouraged me to work with alternative sources and bring in lots of stuff from other fields of study as well into the field of history, which is why I ended up writing my master's thesis on the history of Star Trek.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, we can talk about that later if you want. So basically, I was a socio-political history of how Star Trek reflected the issues going on in American politics throughout the Cold War period. And so that was a really, really fascinating one. I'm turning that into a book eventually. I need to expand it. And yeah, so that was kind of how I ended up in history. It was a long process of figuring out what I wanted to do. I've had a lot of other weird jobs throughout my life. I went to culinary school at one point. I ran a bakery. I have done a bunch of stuff, which I think is actually really beneficial to me in the study of history, because I have so much extra knowledge about things outside of my field, which I think sometimes historians neglect.
Nice, very nice. So let's start at the beginning. So you said earlier that you were not interested in history because of professors and teachers who made it boring. So walk us through that. Like, talk us through the beginnings, so to speak.
Yeah, so I had these teachers in high school, and even when I first started college, that they just made history really, really boring. I remember a particular teacher, and I can't remember what year this was, but I remember them saying, like, here is a timeline, memorize this timeline. It's not my job to make history fun.
Ooh, that does not sound enjoyable.
it was not. It was all about dates, and it was all about, just memorizing a timeline of when things happened, which had nothing to do with why things happened or how they influenced each other, or what the greater story was.
Mm-hmm.
I always loved English class. I was always very into literature, and I like to see the cause and effect of things
Right.
in literature. And I didn't see that in history. All I saw was, here, memorize when the Battle of Hastings was, and memorize when the Magna Carta was signed, and these kind of things. And it it was mind numbing for me, because
Mm.
I tell my students now, I'm not good at dates. Dates are not a thing that I'm very good at. I will mess those up occasionally. I'll mean 1865 and I say 1872 or something,
Right.
which I don't think is that big a deal in the grand scheme of things, as long as I understand that something happened before something else, Uh,
Right.
and so I just really, really disliked history because of that. I had so many history teachers who were like that throughout my education. And I I don't know, it just didn't hit me as something that could be a fun thing to study. Um, and that didn't really change until I want to say I was about my mid 20s, so 24, 25. And
Okay.
I had already been, I'd been kind of not knowing what I wanted to do, kind
Mm-hmm.
of at a loss. And I was having a conversation with my best friend about a particular event in history, which was uh, the Dutch East India Company,
Ooh, okay. All right.
something that they had done. He was researching it for a book he was writing, and we ended up having a discussion about it. And I realized, oh, this is history. I actually do like history. I just don't like it when it's about dates. I like it when it's about people and
Right.
culture and social issues and things like that. That's what I like. And I realized that that could be what history is. And so when I went back to school, I was like, you know what? I'm going to get a history degree. That's what I'm going to do. And I kind of fell in love with it.
Nice. Very nice. So it's almost kind of your story is very similar to almost mine a little bit. So I was never interested in history. I actually want to go into graphic design and illustration. I actually applied to the Laguna College of Art and Design in SoCal. I wasn't that good of a drawer. I wasn't that good of an illustrator, but I loved art. It wasn't until middle school that I actually started to like get involved with history. And it was at the time I was more like memorization of history. I could easily remember like a date, a time, and in school and like class for like those activities, everyone wanted me on their team just because I remembered dates. And when I got into high school, I knew, okay, I want to pursue history, but what field of history? Medieval, colonial. Initially, I wanted to go into military history because I was very fascinated with the weapons of the time, the generals, the tactics. Then that changed into it wasn't history, but it was interdisciplinary studies, Asian studies, focusing on Chinese history. And it wasn't until I went to my master's program that I decided, okay, I'm going to specify, I'm going to focus on classical history because that is a broad time frame. I still research late antiquities, medieval, colonial, Japanese, but classical history is where I decided, okay, I need to pick here because if I don't, I'm just going to drive myself crazy. And almost like what you said, like I did have professors and teachers and like growing up that taught history. It was kind of more like memorization. But when I got into high school, there was one professor, one teacher who was really, really good, who really instilled this sense of like pursuing history. Shout out to Miss Singleton at New View Bridge. She was a great teacher, and it made me love history so much. And I love talking about it, even though some of my friends say, just stop, just stop. You need to stop talking about history. So when you got your bachelor's and then your master's and went to teach history, what was ultimately your goal? You're telling your students, or not goal, but like your promise to your students of like, this is how I'm going to teach history, because every professor has their own teaching style for whatever subject it is. So how do you approach teaching history to your students?
Well, I try to avoid the things that I hated about teaching, about learning history, which was, memorizing timelines, memorizing things like that. I'm much more interested in teaching cause and effect,
Right.
and how different events affect later events and things like that. So I teach predominantly American history at the
Right.
university I teach at. I also teach women's history, and so there's you know a lot there. And of course, some of it you can't avoid. Sometimes some listing of facts, right? You can't avoid the this happened on this date, this happened on this date kind of stuff. You can't avoid it. But I do like to kind of try to teach how things fit together, because I kind of
Right.
view history as part treasure hunt, part puzzle. You're
Right.
trying to figure out which events affected other events. Like just the other day, somebody asked me a question. I have a TikTok where I talk about history stuff, and somebody asked me a question about the Transcontinental Railroad, and they asked me, "Is there anything interesting about the Transcontinental Railroad that doesn't generally get taught?" And
Okay.
and I was like, oh, that's a very weird specific question, but actually, yes. And so I went into talking about how the building of the Transcontinental Railroad caused the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which is one of the major linchpins that kind of pours fuel on the fire of the Civil War.
Yes.
So it's not something that cause and effect is not something that a lot of teachers focus on. They'll teach a unit about the Transcontinental Railroad, and then later they'll teach a unit on the Civil War, but never those two things will connect.
Right.
They don't
Right.
teach how it connects. And so I try to make history a story is really what I try to do with history. And really one of the things that I also try to do is I tell my students at the beginning of the semester, I ask them, like, how many of you hated history in high school? And a lot of them will raise their hands. And usually I respond with, I cannot promise you that you won't hate history after you leave this class. I can't promise you that. I can't promise that I will instill a love of history and make you switch your major. Like, I can't promise that. But
Right.
what I can promise is that you will leave this room with enough information to be able to tell fact from fiction. So I really major on critical thinking in my class,
Right.
analyzing sources, saying, who is the person who wrote this? Why did they write it? What was their reason behind it?
Right.
Because I really want students to, especially when it comes to American history, leave my class knowing that people will try to use history against them. They will try
Mm-hmm.
to use it as a tool to as propaganda, essentially. And I
Right.
don't want them to fall for that. And so that's one of my main goals in my classes. I usually every semester have a thing on how to register to vote, how to research candidates and issues and things like that as well,
Right.
because it all ties in together. So
Right. So the pretty much seems of how I'm understanding is like when you teach history, you're almost sense teaching history and so like, oh, you may not enjoy it, but you're at least going to know enough information. So if you hear something that's not true, you at least have some information and maybe some facts to back it up, which I think is great. And I only think, with the age of media, I'm sure you may have seen like a lot of these like self-proclaimed historians or people that just study history that just like talk about it with no fact behind it, yet everyone believes that to be fact. And that's kind of scary because I've seen a lot of those that are just have no basis on whatsoever. And a lot of people like pull that information and like give reviews like, oh, this is great. I didn't know that. I didn't see this. And it's like, but that's not really true. And then kind of leads into my next question. When you began teaching, what was the initial feedback from your students? Do you actually remember like maybe one student who may have come up to you during class and like talk to you saying, I wish I had this kind of teacher in high school?
actually, yeah, I get that a lot, mostly because I think it also helps that I'm not an ogre about extensions and things like that also. So I pretty much would give students extensions on papers and things like that whenever they ask for them. I'm not, so they like me more because of that. Definitely. That helps a lot with my reputation. But yes, I have students who tell me all the time that they didn't like history before they came into my classroom, and they did like it when they left. Like I said, I can't promise that that's going to be the effect, but the fact that I have had numerous students tell me that means a lot to me. I've had, students contact me semesters later to ask my opinion on something, or be like, hey, I saw this YouTube video where this person's talking about history. can you tell me if it's accurate or not, or things like that. So they kind of
Right.
rely as a resource later, which I really love. And yeah, so there are students definitely who have said, it means a lot to them that I delve into things that other history teachers don't always talk about. I had a student, I want to say 2 semesters ago, who was Navajo.
Right.
I'm in Arizona, so there's a lot of Navajo students. And in one of the classes, I was delving into the history of the Navajo creation myth and how that impacted the way they viewed themselves. And at the end of class, she said, "I have never had a history teacher in an American history class bother to talk about Native American history."
Wow.
And I said, "Well, that's patently ridiculous, right? Obviously, we should be talking about about Native American history in an American history."
Right.
And she said, "Well, I've just never had anybody do it, and you did it so well. Like everything you talked about is exactly the way my grandmother told me about
Mm.
stories." And I was like, "Oh, that means a lot to me, because I'm always a little bit scared delving into that. It's not my specialty." Um, and so yeah, I've had a lot of really good feedback from students, and I think that it's been really good. I have actually had one student not change their major, but change their minor into history. So that was pretty.
Ooh, okay.
So they added a minor to their major, which was nice.
Nice. So would you say that that's kind of like saying that your promise to your students has been validated in a sense that you see that what you're instilling in them, even if some of them may go into history or may not go into history, they're taking something away from it. They're now more informed, and that kind of like cements that I'm making an impact in my students' lives.
Yeah, I think that's definitely the case. Like I said, I've had lots of students who've said that it's really helped them to know what's going on in the world, to kind of bring things together and realize how major events impact each other and things like
Right.
that. Which I think has been majorly beneficial. And I try to connect history to modern events as much as possible too, to be like, okay, here's this bank crisis in the 1860s. I'm going to compare that to like the housing market collapse in the 2000s. Let's talk about how those two things are similar and how we haven't learned our lesson about regulating business or whatever.
Right.
Which I think really helps because it makes them realize that we can learn things from the past that have influence on the issues that we have today. We don't have to keep reinventing the wheel. We can just look at the past and see what we need to learn from that. So yeah, I think it's worked out pretty well. Obviously, you get these end of course surveys, these anonymous surveys where students give responses.
Oh, the rate the professor kind of thing.
Yeah, and I get some really good ones. I do, but every now and then you get the one that is like, oh, so boring, or like just spends too much time lecturing, and I'm like, it's a lecture heavy class. I don't know what you wanted. Like,
Yeah, I don't know what you expect.
and only one time have I gotten a comment that said, it just brings too much of her personal politics into the classroom, and I'm like, buddy, if I was bringing my personal politics into the classroom, this would be a very different class.
Yes.
Like, this would be very different. I bring it more into my women's history class than I do in my American history, simply because that's a 400 level class. So I'm dealing with more mature students, but
right. And I'm actually glad you brought that up because actually this is one topic I did want to talk about and then lead into a big question is, so I'm going to try to word this as best I can. So for those who don't know, like, I'm a big historian fan. I love researching history, but I think maybe you can agree, Professor Meredith, that the history field and humanities has kind of been topsy-turvy in the last few years. History has definitely taken kind of a blunt. It's been deconstructed. It's been perverted. It's definitely been altered to suit goals. Now, I agree that history needs to be pursued in every field. History needs to be shown. But then to have like not appropriate discussion in a sense, like, acknowledging the other person's side for like historical topic or debate does not always end well and kind of really shows that, why should history be pursued if it's going to have like these issues? Case in point, which I'll lead into the question. I went to school in the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. And not to get too political, but my school hosted the last election of 2016. I cannot tell you how, after that announcement came out, the nomination who won the presidency, the entire tone of the campus changed. And then there was topics of like U.S. history, and there was almost like a big lawsuit between one professor and one student in a history class. It got
Right.
really, really ugly. And then ultimately, when we see this, like these topics of history, it's like, oh my gosh. And we talk about earlier, like the perversions, like on like the social media and all that stuff, like projecting a history that's not true or downplaying one aspect of history in a wide scope. Ultimately, for you, Professor Meredith, as an historian, what continues to drive you to pursue history? What is your why?
Spite. At this point, it's just spite. But really, that's what drives me in many cases. If you take a look at my TikTok account, like generally speaking, that's my why. As far as my TikTok account is just like, oh, I'm gonna say this because I know it's gonna make people mad. It's not necessarily the healthiest reason to pursue history, but it's kind of always been my why. Even when I worked in politics, I kind of used that as my energy source.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, what it comes down to is that I really, really dislike when someone uses history for propaganda purposes. I have a really major problem with people who misrepresent history, whether because they were taught bad history or because they're intentionally misrepresenting it.
Right.
Which is more often the case, I think. And using it to try to manipulate people, because there's, as a historian, I see a long history of that. That has always been the case throughout history, that these, demagogues and dictators try to create their own narratives of history that prop up their power structure. And when you're seeing that happening again in your own country right now, it is very terrifying, because as a historian, you can look back and see how that played out in previous cases. And so, yeah, that's a big part of it, is just that I think that it's possibly the most important subject right now is history. And I know that sounds self-serving because I'm a historian, but I think that for the most part, what we're seeing here is this huge perversion of history, where it's being used to try to, well, you mentioned just a second ago, the whole like both sides issue. There are issues in history where there are not two sides to the issue, right? I'm not going to sit here and be like, oh, well, when I'm teaching about slavery in America, let's teach the controversy. Let's teach about how the slaves benefited from slavery. No, because it's not historically accurate. I'm not going to sink to their level, right? To even acknowledge that as a possibility, because it's simply not the case. I know enough about the records of that time, even though the Civil War is not my specialty area. I know enough about it to know that that's wrong. You're not doing that correctly. And like, you're believing the propaganda of the slave owners at the time, if you believe that. So that's just something, that's the way I view it. I think that it's extremely dangerous to have history being rewritten by politicians, because they're always doing it for their own good.
Right. And kind of like a small tangent before I go into the next question. Now, have you ever used like forms like history videos for like your lesson plans, as well as, I don't know if you have looked this up or maybe someone has brought this up in a class of yours, but alternate history videos. Now, I actually love alternate history because while it is fiction, I love the really good ones that really do the research to accurately show how one event might have changed. Like, there is one person, I forget his name, but he does the most detailed alternate history, especially U.S. history. He has a whole series and talks about, what if the Civil War happened during the presidency of Andrew Jackson? What if the Indian Removal Act didn't go into place? What if the United States lost the Mexican-American War? How differently would that change? And I love that. I love that when having those discussions. And have you ever used like those kind of videos? Maybe not specific alternate history videos, but like YouTube videos from like people who have like studied history or history enthusiasts to like help bring more awareness on like a topic that you're discussing for that day?
I will use occasionally, especially if it's something that I feel like I can't explain very well. Like when I'm teaching
Right.
about the Great Depression, I tend to use videos, and not alternate history videos, but I tend to use videos from other historians or
Right.
who are explaining things like buying on margin, because it's not going to be easy for me to explain that. I'm not going to make it make sense, and so it's easier to use something from someone else that has done a really good job explaining it with
Right.
graphics,
Of course.
because it's complicated as a topic. I've never really used any alternate history stuff. I think that if I was teaching some of the higher level courses about
Right.
American
Of course.
history, it might be something to talk about with students. I don't think my intro freshmen are really up to that point of having that discussion about the cause, that much cause and effect of like,
Right.
what
Of course.
happens if the Hindenburg doesn't explode,
Mhm.
which is they're very interesting. It's a very
They
interesting
are.
way
Yeah.
to dive into the cause and effect of history. My students just aren't really usually there yet as far as that kind of higher level thinking about history. I do use some stuff from alternate history when I talk about the history of the Cold War. I am very much a fan of showing a couple of scenes from the Apple TV series For All Mankind.
Oh, okay.
Because it is a fascinating alternate history, which really delves into the ideas of what changes if the Russians get to the moon first.
Right.
And it has a lot of interesting changes as far as the presidency and social issues and political
Right.
issues, things like that play out. Mostly I use things from the series where it talks about Werner von Braun's position in Operation Paperclip and things like that. But yeah, I've used that in class before. Certainly, I like to bring popular culture into the classroom whenever I can, because it gives the students a break from my voice. It gives me a break from talking, and it breaks things up a little bit, wakes them up midway through my hour-long lecture.
Right, right, nice. Now, also, on your bio on LinkedIn, it says you've also worked on, nonfiction and fiction works. It's also writing. So, how do you kind of like blend the two together in the sense of, teaching history as well as writing your own topics, your own thoughts on theses and papers to hopefully maybe join like a historical journal or this guild of history?
Well, I mean, right now I have an article that I've just submitted to the National Council for Public History, their book, The Public Historian, or their magazine, The Public Historian. That's mostly on how to use podcasting effectively for
Right.
but yeah, I mean, my fiction writing, I do kind of try to blend my love of history with that. So the current series I'm working on right now is set in the 1920s
Ooh, okay.
so I think it might possibly be the first murder mystery series that has footnotes. Because I didn't want to. There are a lot of things in there where I am taking real historical events or real historical figures, and
Right.
I'm using them in the plot in certain ways. And I want to add in the context to the footnotes to be like, okay, yes, this person really existed. Yes, they were a bad person, but they didn't do, X. This thing
Right.
that I said they did. They didn't actually do that. I have like a really, really one of the most corrupt police chiefs in the LAPD history. From the 1920s. He's
Oh boy.
books, and I'm like, yes, he's a bad guy. He's a horrible person, but he didn't do this thing. Like that's made up. That's fictional. So I do a lot of historical research when I'm working on those books, even though in a way I am writing it as an alternate history in its own way, so that I don't have to get everything 100% correct. But
Nice. That's actually just like me with my own writing. I actually finished writing one book of mine, which is what if the Persians won the Greco-Persian invasion, the second one, and how differently would that have changed? And everyone thinks, all the Persians would have destroyed democracy, the Persians would have butchered all of Athens. But in my research, it's like, not really true. I mean, the Persians were probably at the time the most diverse empire at this given point. I mean, they didn't like butcher. I mean, yes, they would have had like quelled the revolts, but they pretty much were like wanting to include other cultures into their society. I mean, you had Egyptians, you had Babylonians, you had Assyrians, you had Ionians, and all this culture together. And in my research, pretty much, which I hated doing that again because it reminded me I have to read so much. I have to do footnotes. I have to read in a certain style, which actually then leads to my next question. So when you are teaching on your students, when it comes to like reading history, like from like reference books or like reading from like a book list, how do you teach them to read that? Because that's another thing I don't think a lot of people really understand when it comes to like studying history is not only just learning dates, but like, you know, the cause and effects, but also when you're reading like a nonfiction book or a reference book, there's really a specific mindset when reading, like, you know, what exactly you're trying to look for. Like, what was the author's mentality when writing this? What is their own biases? And ultimately, what is the author trying to say? So how do you like instruct that to your students who have possibly, you know, never read a book with that mindset?
Well, I usually use I can't remember the exact phraseology now. I haven't taught a class since spring, so I can't remember the exact phraseology I use on the slide for it. But basically, I have a set of like the four W's or the five W's or whatever, which is like who, what, when, why, and where, essentially. And so you have to analyze a source that way, and that's the initial analysis of a source, which is if you need to look at who wrote it, when they wrote it, you know, why they wrote it, who they're connected to, what the, you know, if they have some sort of major, you know, connection to some sort of think tank or some sort of political party or something like that. And then you have to analyze the source in that context. I don't have to do that a lot with my intro level course because I pretty much just have, I give them sources to use in their assignments. I kind of say, okay, here's a selection of sources. If you want to go outside this list and do your own research, you can. But if you should ask me before you use something really off the wall. I had to learn to give very specific instructions occasionally in my first semester teaching when I had somebody turn in a paper on or an assignment talking about the eugenics movement in America, which cited the Daily Stormer.
Oh boy.
Which is a neo-Nazi website. And I was like, no, you can't use that as a source at all, ever. Please never use that as a source again. And I don't think they knew what they had cited. Like they went online and they Googled like history of eugenics in America or whatever, and they were looking for specific information, and they just found this website and they stumbled upon it, which is, you know, so I've had to learn to be a lot more specific in saying you need to analyze these sources. And I'm very specific in the please stick to .edu and .org like sources. Please don't go to like random.coms because
definitely.
So you have to be very careful with that, definitely. But that's one of the major things in my upper level courses when I'm teaching like women's history, that I tend to try to teach to kind of convey to them how to read academic articles, which is basically that you don't read them. Which I'm not saying don't read them at all. I'm saying that generally how you handle like a large workload in grad school is that when you get, you know, you're assigned like 12 academic articles, you know, to read for your next seminar. And each one of them is like, you know, 12, 15, 20 pages long. You're not going to read all of those. You're not going to read every single word of it. You read the abstract, you read the intro, you read the conclusion, and then you kind of skim the middle parts. With anything specific, like, you know, if you find a section that's like, oh, that's particularly interesting, you read that full section. But so I try to kind of convey that there are shortcuts. There are ways to make your life easier, which I wish I had been taught as an undergrad, because I had to learn all of that when I went to grad school. My first semester of grad school.
Same.
Awful. I was like, oh my God, I have to read all of this. And then literally one of my professors took me aside because I was complaining about it, I guess, before class. And he took me aside, was like, no, you don't have to read every page.
No.
Thank God for him telling me that, because I probably would have lost my mind.
That's actually, it's very so true. Like when I was in my undergrad, I actually did not read a single book. I just did like the basic notes. When I got into my master's program, I realizing, oh, I actually have to read now. And then I have to read a certain way. Like almost like what you said, like reading the prologue or the introduction, reading the conclusion, and then just skimming through the middle to see if that actually holds true to what the author's trying to say. The middle is pretty much, you know, his examples and his points. And from that, I really had to like truly find my craft and like with reading. And that especially got true when I got my master's exam and reading 60 books, 20 from each professor. It was ridiculous. It's terrifying, but they ultimately made it fun and enjoyable. Now, the next question I want to ask you is actually going back to what you talked about originally, which is, of course, your TikTok as well as your podcast. So tell me about how that came about, and ultimately, did you kind of like have a goal in mind of where you wanted to be at initially, and has that changed? And were you kind of worried in the sense of with the age of digital media and going back to what we said about digital history, were you worried in the sense of like how someone may see that from like either perspective business or work or fellow colleagues see that and how they would interpret it in one way that's different from how you presented it?
Yeah, I mean, there's always a concern, right? I actually just spoke to a graduate seminar at Johns Hopkins a couple of weeks ago about just this topic, about how to kind of what we called it was defensive engagement, which is, talking about how you engage with the public, because public history, you're going to have to do that, right? And I would say that my main area right now is kind of public history in a grand sense, because I'm working so much on trying to convey history to public audiences. And so it's always a concern in many ways. I have been using social media and Tumblr and TikTok and Twitter and things like that so long that I kind of, maybe I don't even think about it anymore, which probably isn't the best way to handle it, but I just kind of have my style and I run with it. But yeah, of course, there's always a concern in the age of social media. I have actually had some issues here and there with HR. Only once have I actually had a meeting with HR, and they told me that I should be more careful about what I post on social media. But it was a whole thing that it involved being doxxed by some people who were like super pro Confederacy people on Twitter.
Oh, okay.
It was a whole weird thing. In the end, they couldn't really, the HR was like, yeah, you didn't really do anything wrong, just be more careful next time. But it's very stressful. I honestly didn't have a goal in mind when I started my TikTok account. I started the TikTok while I was in grad school, almost at the very beginning of the pandemic.
Okay.
I started it not really with the intent of it being about history or anything like that. It was just a desperate move for some sort of social engagement because I was going crazy. I was in a 120 square foot apartment and like working on grad school stuff, and I couldn't go anywhere or do anything, see my friends. And I needed some sort of social engagement or I was going to go crazy. So yeah, basically I didn't really start it with the goal of it being a history account at all. Ended up becoming that as I started talking about my thesis and things like that a lot with my followers as I continued on through grad school. And so it's become much more about history now. I still talk about like pop culture and feminism and stuff like that on the page. And I do, I obviously do consider like what I post. I'm not going to go on there and make thirst traps, right? I'm not going to go on TikTok and make videos where I'm, wearing scandalous things or anything like that. Not that I would have in the first place, but certainly not given my job, right? It wouldn't fit my image.
Right.
And so I do consider things like that. And, like, oh, I'm going to post this video. I should probably put on a different shirt. I'm going to record this. Let me get something that's a little higher cut,
Right.
or something like that. So that's pretty much where it begins and ends as far as me worried about my social media presence. I kind of figure that if people don't like who I am and they don't want to hire me because of that, I didn't want to work with them in the first place. So
okay.
Well, the professor whose graduate class I talked to at Johns Hopkins the other day, he's a mutual of mine on TikTok, and he told me once that I have my social media method is like the baseball bat method.
Oh, that's what you said in the pre-recorded, like.
Yeah, it's the baseball bat method, and I told his students that I'm pretty sure he meant that in the Carrie Underwood took a Louisville Slugger to both headlights kind of way. Because that's how I approach dealing with like kind of idiots on the internet, right?
Nice.
If somebody's asking a question in good faith, I'm going to give them a polite answer. If somebody's asking a question not in good faith, they're going to get roasted. And that's
Right.
pretty much the way of handling it.
Nice. So would you say that your TikTok and your podcast were kind of made around the same time, or did the TikTok come first and then your podcast?
So the TikTok definitely came first. I have done a lot of podcasting in the past. I've had like 2 podcasts that were pretty decently successful back when I worked in politics. But obviously I got out of that. Politics was giving me an ulcer. Like I couldn't do it anymore.
Right.
So I had been considering doing a podcast for a while that was centered around American history. But I had not had time to get into it. And then this summer I was just like, you know what? Let's do it. Let's finally get it off the ground. Stop putting it off. Stop saying, you know, you'll do it next year, you'll do it next semester or whatever. Just get it done. And so I just got it started. I think I started it in May of this year. So it's
okay.
It's pretty new. It's a pretty new project for me. I'm at like, I think I'm working on episode 20 right now.
Oh, nice.
So when I started it, I was doing 2 episodes a week, which was too much. And now I'm down to 1. I decided to adjust it down to a little bit different. And so, yeah, it's a really fun experiment. I'm having a lot of fun with it. I've, met some really interesting people through TikTok, which have really helped me grow my network of historians that I work with.
Nice.
So yeah, it's been really useful, I think.
That's awesome. That's actually interesting. We brought about your TikTok kind of being around the time of the pandemic, which is interesting because that's actually around the time when I actually started my podcast, The Wandering Scribe, and it was on Anchor. I didn't start YouTube until just this year. And initially when I started my Anchor podcast, it was just with authors, just like indie authors from my inner circle. When I moved out here to Orange, I decided I'm going to expand. And that's when I started interviewing historians. And then when I got to season 3, I was like, oh, I like this now. And then I launched my YouTube channel and then started doing interviews with people. And then the idea of the Historians Lounge came about, which that was awesome. Because, I've learned so much from a lot of different people. I've learned about Nathaniel Green. I've learned about Lincoln's childhood. I've learned about the history of the Marine Corps, the history of the Confederate sailors post-Civil War, the Roman Navy, Coptics in early Byzantium, the study of saints. I've learned so much, and I love that. I love learning from different people. I love learning these different aspects, which then kind of leads into my next question is, and you've actually brought this up too, which is, your thesis on Star Trek and during the Cold War. So what would you say to someone who says like, oh, why would you teach that? I mean, that's not history. How is it relevant? Like, how does learning about Star Trek and the Cold War relate to like the modern day? Like, what have you found in your research that correlates the two together? And why do you think it's important to learn about like pop culture and history together, whether it's comic books in history, film in history, or even just food in history?
Right, and they're all great things to study. I'm actually working on putting together a course right now as an online course, which is about the history of the Cold War through music. Right now.
Okay.
But, yeah, so I think that one of the things that we tend to forget when we're looking at something that's fictional is that a person wrote it, right?
Right.
This isn't like somebody took a camera to the 22nd century and recorded stuff on an actual starship. Someone in our current day wrote this. And so always there's going to be elements of what's currently going on. And I can't remember the exact quote, but I quoted this writer, Kodwa Eshun, in my thesis, where he says that science fiction isn't about the future. Science fiction is about taking the present and creating the future by critiquing, essentially. And I'm definitely misquoting him there. But that's essentially what the point was that like science fiction isn't ever about the future. It's about critiquing the present. It's about saying these are the problems of today, but removing it far enough into the future that people don't feel judged. By watching it. So when you look at something like Star Trek, the original series, which I covered all 5 of the original cable network shows, but with Star Trek, the original series, you see this coming out in the mid 60s, where you have a lot of things going on in American society that are incredibly contentious. There's a lot of arguments about things like, the civil rights, the racial civil rights movement, issues of the Vietnam War, issues of government, government power and things like that are going on at this time period. And so when you start to look at the episodes of this series, you see very pointed social commentaries being
Right.
made. And it's also very interesting to watch how the social commentaries shift, especially in reference to the Vietnam War. There's a whole shifting of narrative throughout, all of the seasons, where they go from being kind of positive about the Vietnam War to being very negative about the war.
Right.
Series. And it's, some of it's very subtle, and some of it is really just, straight to the face, like obvious what they're trying to do. Like the episode about the race of people that are white on one side, black on the other. Like,
wow, that's heavy-handed.
That's a very heavy-handed episode. It's a bad one, but it's very heavy-handed. Yeah, and then you get into like the later shows where it becomes even more obvious that they were very specifically making a social commentary about specific events, and sometimes even not even realizing how apt their analysis was. I remember one story when I was writing the section on Deep Space Nine, where Ira Behr, the showrunner of Deep Space Nine, talked about the fact that they had been writing this episode. They were going into starting to film the episode, and it was a time travel episode. And they were going back to the 21st century and to these places called that were basically encampments, where all the homeless were, shoved into these encampments for their own good. And as they started to film the episode, someone comes up to him and hands him the newspaper. And it's that day, or like the day before, the LA mayor had talked about creating sanctuary districts, essentially.
Oh, wow.
Talking about the exact same thing. And Ira Behr sitting there looking at this and being like, I didn't want this episode to be as relevant as it apparently is now, and so he didn't even realize how socially relevant the episode was going to become. And there's just a lot of very interesting feedback between what is going on socially at the time of the writing and the series. And I find that really, really fascinating. And I think it's a very interesting way for us to look back and see what a society was like by looking at the fiction that they created, because it can tell you something about that society.
I have to agree, especially when you look at like the old 1950s sci-fi films that talk about like the big monster ones. Okay, them, the giant ants. Very silly premise, but the whole concept was about atomic energy and what it actually means now that it exists. That humanity has this capability, and the science is very interesting. Yes, the science is dated, but the commentary is still relevant at the time. And then when you look at, Godzilla was a huge metaphor for the atomic bomb and what it meant. It is very fascinating. So there are ways you can use fiction and other aspects of pop culture to really, really explore, history and what it connects to. Like, okay, Star Wars. I remember one person said that Star Wars, it is like Earth, but it's so far away that it's not going to be like Earth. Like the Ewoks. For some reasons, one person made the connection saying that the Ewoks supposed to represent the Vietnam War, which I don't know how you can make the argument, but it is supposed to like share similarities with Earth, but has no relations to Earth, and that's how we can able to make that connection. And I think that is a very fascinating way to explore history. And going in later when we see with other modern day pop culture films trying to do that, at least how I see it, it's kind of like not the best representation. So, and that's just my own thing. But what would you say now is like the dangers? And actually, this is no discussion. What do you think are probably like the dangers of like someone using pop culture to try to show like the history nowadays?
So I saw, this is actually really funny because I just saw something a couple of nights ago that a friend sent me on Facebook. And it was from I can't even remember what the group was on Facebook, but basically it was, it had a picture of like a bunch of people sitting around a desk reading big thick textbooks, and at the top it says like how they study history, and then at the bottom it was a whole like series of clips from Assassin's Creed, and it said how I study history.
Oh.
I commented on it and I said, as a historian who loves Assassin's Creed, no, do not learn
Same.
history from Assassin's Creed, right?
No.
It is vastly misrepresenting tons of history in many, many ways. And it's also highly oversimplifying history and creating, you know, like these narratives that to create the story for the game. And there's certainly parts of it that I find genuinely interesting as a historian. And I say, okay, that is actually a very interesting commentary on historical events or things like that. But I can only understand that in the context of actually being a historian.
Right.
If you are not a historian, if you're just some like 16-year-old boy sitting in your bedroom playing the game, you don't have the understanding of history necessary to parse fact from fiction.
Right.
In that way. And so it becomes very dangerous for people to just learn history without any additional context from these video games or movies. I had the same discussion with someone the other day about how 300's not an accurate representation of
It's
history.
not. It's based off of the graphic novel.
And even then, the graphic not like it was intentionally made to be a commentary. It's not made to be a historical look at what actually occurred at Thermopylae.
Right.
An actual commentary on the Spartan society or Persian society. Like this is not an accurate representation of these events. And so it becomes very dangerous when people misrepresent history in that way. And there are ways to do it. And I'm not saying that all films, that all like historical TV shows or historical films need to be 100% historically accurate. There is a kind of a scale here, from good to bad as far as mythologizing the past, but it's just, we need to make people more aware and make them realize, no, you can't get an accurate historical understanding from Assassin's Creed or just like you wouldn't tell somebody that Tomb Raider is an accurate representation of archaeological practices. Like
no,
it's not that. So you have to remember that things are fiction and they are going to fictionalize things. One of my biggest problems always with Assassin's Creed is the fact that the original games have the Borgias as the bad guys, which I could go into. I've written an article about it on one of the blogs I write for. But the Borgias weren't actually that bad. I mean, they were bad, but in the context of every other pope at the time, they weren't that bad.
Right. It is really interesting because I love Assassin's Creed. I actually played the first game and played all the way through up to the current one. But I have to agree, it is very fascinating. It's a very fictionalized approach to history. Like when people look at the assassins, they think, oh, they're the freedom fighters. Well, not necessarily true. The real assassins pretty much destabilized their region when the Seljuks were in power. And some have argued that it's because of the assassins that allowed the Crusaders, at least in the first and possibly second crusade, to really come down and establish a foothold because the assassins destabilized the Seljuk dynasty. It is very fascinating. And
I love the games. I have most of them. I haven't finished all of the ones I have. I buy them when they're on sale, and then I play through them. I'm playing Origins right now, but it's there's nothing wrong with enjoying them. I would never say, don't play Assassin's Creed. I play Tomb Raider, I play Assassin's Creed, I play Uncharted. I just play them with the knowledge that they're not giving me an accurate understanding of history.
Right. It is true. It is true. And kind of leading into, we only had like the last few questions of the interview, and I think these are like the really important ones. So for you, Professor Meredith, looking back on, who you are right now with like, you're a teacher, you now have your own podcast, you now have your own TikTok, and how you like approach history now where it's actually engaging. In that sense, in regards to teaching, who would you say has like been like your biggest mentor when you went to like your bachelor's and master's? Like who really stood out to you and like one of your history teachers that really kind of helped you but get you a better understanding of history?
So I didn't really have any very close relationships with any of my history professors in undergrad. I did most of my coursework online, so I didn't really develop that kind of connection with them. But during grad school, I had two professors. One of them ended up being my thesis advisor, Dr. Vanderwall, who was my thesis advisor. and Dr. Shield, who was my second reader on my thesis. And both of them were incredibly impactful in my studying of history and understanding of history, I think. And so they were definitely great mentors for me. And nowadays, I have developed these really, really great back and forth relationships with a lot of other professors and historians online. Dr. Stormer from Johns Hopkins, who I spoke to his class, I would say I don't think he would classify himself as my mentor. he kind of sees us as peers, but I see him as a mentor. So he'll just have to take that title. Yeah, he'll have to accept it. I'm not going to take it back. He's a mentor.
Nice. And in that regard, when you decide to pursue history, teaching history, and then now looking back to where you are right now, have you ever got a sense of like validation from like other professors or other historians like in the community saying your work in history is very, very unique, it's very, very approachable, and this is truly where you belong? Or did you not sort of like get a sense of validation in the sense that you pursued it to be validated, but instead your work has garnered you this validation because of your merit?
I mean, I think that I have a lot of people that I've worked with who have said that I'm very good at teaching. I'm very good with connecting with students. That I am good at history, and communicating history to people. So I feel like most people that I'm working with, they respect me. And it's hard for me to say that because I do have major imposter syndrome. But it's lately I've been working with so many great people who are so good at their jobs, and they also think I'm good at what I do. And it's kind of like them slowly trying to smother my imposter syndrome to death. Because if they think I'm doing a good job, then clearly I must be. And so yeah, I found that it's been extremely helpful to have so many other historians that I respect around me who I can interact with and have that back and forth with.
So would you say those people have been like your biggest supporters in your ventures?
I would say, yeah. I mean, I have, I will say my biggest supporters are my parents, like 100%. That I currently live with them rent free, so they're my biggest supporters. Gotta say thank you to them for that, because rent's expensive in my town. But yeah, they've all been major supporters in getting, making me feel motivated to actually accomplish the things that I want to do, and do things like creating online courses and engaging with the public and engaging with the people through my podcast and things like that. They've been really, really useful.
Awesome, awesome. So now getting towards like the very last question, ultimately my personal favorite I like to ask is, so Professor Meredith, with all your years of learning, all your years of teaching, what is your word of wisdom to those who want to pursue history in whatever aspect they want to, be it teaching, be it writing, be it digital creation? What is your word of wisdom to those who want to pursue history in a career?
It's about passion. It's not about don't go into it thinking you're going to make a lot of money. Like, yeah, we can't all be Ken Burns. We're not all going to make tons of money off of this. And I didn't even realize how difficult it was to make this into a career until after I graduated from grad school. But it's find the thing that you love to study and make it work. Like for me, I had a lot of other ideas about more academic stuff to write my master's thesis on, but when it came down to it, I wanted to write about something I was passionate about, and I love Star Trek. So, and I love science fiction. So let's find a way to make that into it. Now I am very into into women's history, and so my newest projects have a lot to do with that. And I'm actually considering doing a PhD in gender studies because
Okay.
area. And so I'm really leaning into just my interest areas. And so you have to be passionate about it. If you're not passionate about it, don't bother doing it. Just, you're going to burn out. You're going to be bored to tears, and you're not going to find any fulfillment in it. But also just be practical about it and understand that it costs a lot of money to go to grad school. Takes a lot of time to go to grad school.
Yes.
The financial return is not that great in a lot of cases. So Like if I go back to get my PhD, I'm going back to Europe for that because it's free. Like I'm not doing it here in the States. I'm not crazy. I'm not taking out any more student loans if I can help it.
I hear you. I hear you on that.
Yeah, so it's just you have to be passionate about it and you have to be practical about it, which is two things that are completely opposed to each other. But yeah, you have to find a way to make it work. Yeah, just like I said, my current focus right now is like mid 20th century like women's history and how that's had an impact on the way that the politics of the 21st century as far as like women's reproductive rights and things are concerned. I'm working on let me see if I can find it. I'm working my way through this book, The
Modern Woman,
which is the worst thing I've ever read in my entire life. It was written in 1947. It was written entirely to convince women and shame women into going back into the home and leaving the workplace after World War II.
Oh boy.
It's awful, but it's part of what I'm working on as a PhD proposal. So yeah, it's a very interesting topic.
Nice. Straight to the point. I love it. I love it. And with that, listeners, we have neared the end of this historian's interview. Now, before we officially end it, Professor Meredith, where can people find and engage with you to know more about any works you have coming up, your TikTok, your podcast, and what else you may have in the future?
Yeah, absolutely. So my podcast is super easy to find. It's just bitchyhistory.com. So I have merch actually. So you want got my merch with me right here.
I love it.
Funny jokes from the episodes and stuff like that are on t-shirts. So that's all available on bitchyhistory.com. My TikTok is at Professor Meredith. So it's super easy to find. It's how I'm on most of my social media. I'm known as. I have a few other social medias like Instagram and stuff, but I hardly use them. So if you want to find me online, TikTok's the place to find me. I'm pretty much glued to it 24/7, which is unhealthy, but I also write blog articles for a blog called Perspectives on Pop Culture, where I mostly talk about history, but also things like Roald Dahl or William Golding, Lord of the Flies, like things like that, that I'm just interested in at any given day. So
nice. Well, I'll link all those down below in the description of this video, and make sure to like and subscribe and let us know what was your favorite part of the discussion and what are your overall thoughts on the topic we discussed today. Again, I want to say thank you to our guest, Professor Meredith, for joining us. Professor Meredith, thank you so much for coming on board. This has been a great discussion. I have missed historians interview, so thank you for being my first one in a long time.
I'm happy to do it. Thank you so much for having me.
You're welcome. Well, listeners, I hope you enjoyed this episode. This has been The Wandering Scribe and The Wandering Quill, signing out.